Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Malik Yawm al-Din. إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين آمين سبحان ربك رب العزة عما يصفون وسلام على المرسلين والحمد لله رب العالمين. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Dear viewers, dear participants in this conference, in this Zoom conference conducted by the European Muslim Network. We are living in difficult times. The pandemic forces us to conduct Zoom conferences instead of physical conferences where people are present. But nevertheless, the world is moving on and we are moving along with the world and we are moving along with the new technologies and trying to bring you a variety of topics that are of importance to us and to the public in general. In this conversation series, we are trying to tackle different issues that have a direct or an indirect effect on Muslim lives in certain countries, in certain regions, and the world at large. Today, we are honored to have Dr. Ermin Sinanović with us. And Dr. Sinanović will be delivering a statement or will introduce us to the current situation in the United States with regard to the upcoming presidential elections on the 3rd of November, that in about 10 days, 11 days from now. These elections will have an impact on our lives, whether we desire so or not. The United States, one of the remaining so-called superpowers, does affect lives of Muslims within the borders and boundaries of the United States and beyond. Political decisions made in the United States will have a far-reaching effect on the lives of each and everyone, whether in the United States, whether in Europe, whether in Africa, Asia, or South America. We address this topic from a learned mind, and that is why we have asked Dr. Sinanović to elaborate and to give us his impressions on the developments in the United States. We will discuss the implications that the presidential elections will have on the Muslims in America and on the Muslim communities in Europe. To introduce you to Dr. Ermin Sinanović, I respect his request and short. So what I would like to say about him is that Dr. Sinanović is a member or is the head of the Center for Islam in the Contemporary World. Right now, he is located in Virginia, and he is one of those learned minds who is really trying to analyze the upcoming presidential elections with regard to their impact on the Muslim. For further information on Dr. Sinanović, you may refer to his website or the website of his university, where you'll find a full bio about him. So we would like to keep it as short as it is, and we would like to offer as much time to Dr. Sinanović and also to our respected viewers and participants in this Zoom conference so they can bring forward their questions and their comments. So I would like to offer the floor now to Dr. Sinanović and invite him to make a statement on the topic, the United States presidential elections and the impact they may have on the Muslims within the boundaries of the United States and beyond. Dr. Sinanović, we are so honored to have you with us. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Brother Bilal, for this introduction. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I hope you can all hear me. And it's really an honor to be here and to receive this invitation from you and from the European Muslim Network. And I thank you again for it. I would like to start this conversation with a few minutes of just basic observations about the elections that are in front of us. First observation is that the elections that are in front of us are not just presidential elections, even though that is what is in the eyes and minds of most of the people. Actually, the elections include the elections for the full House of Representatives. All 435 members of the House of Representatives are being elected on November 3rd, as well as 1/3, about 35, I think this time, of Senate members. And this is peculiar to the United States elections, that every 2 years there is an election in the House of Representatives for all the seats. And then every 2 years there is an election for 1/3 of seats in the US Senate. So the House of Representatives and the Senate together constitute US Congress. The House of Representatives had 435 members, all of which are being elected next week. The Senate has 100 members, 35 of whom are up for election. 35 of those seats are up for election next week. And then, of course, the presidential elections that most of our attention is on. I'm mentioning this because it's important. If the president, whoever it is, if a candidate wins presidency, but the members of the opposing political party are controlling majorities in the House and the Senate, that president won't be able to accomplish that much. So what is at stake right now is that, at least what we know currently, is that Joe Biden has a sizable lead over President Trump, and that if these polls turn out to be accurate and correct, if he gets elected, he will have, currently the House of Representatives is majority Democrat. All the polls show that it is going to remain that way. As for the Senate, it is currently under the Republican control. There is a possibility that the Senate might flip, so that even these 35 seats that are at stake right now, that Democrats may win the good majority of them, and then overall have 51, at least 51 seats in the Senate. So it remains to be seen how this is going to play out. So presidential election is important, but so is the election for House of Representatives and for the Senate. Once we know the outcome of all three elections, we will know what's the constellation. In case, for instance, Joe Biden wins presidency and the Democrats retain House of Representatives and they flip the Senate, they'll have full, basically, power to pass laws, to have majorities and whatnot. If there is a split among these, it remains to be seen what kind of split are we going to have. So that's the first thing to keep in mind. Keep your focus not just on presidential elections, but look at the congressional elections. That is to say, the House of Representatives and Senate. The second thing, what's interesting to me in all these discussions and all what has been going on is what is not being discussed. One of the big things that is not being discussed much at all is foreign policy, which is mind-boggling. For the largest power in the world, the superpower of the world, the United States, that has military bases all over the world, whose actions influence and impact much of what's going on in the rest of the world, that foreign policy discussions are really on the margins. It is quite symptomatic and I would say quite astonishing that in the discussions in the first and the last debate, there were supposed to be three, the second one was canceled, so both of these presidential debates, foreign policy was discussed only tangentially. And what is also interesting is that during that time, there was a situation in Nagorno-Karabakh that was happening that was hardly mentioned at all. There is genocide in China against the Uyghur Muslims. That was hardly mentioned at all. In previous elections, this would be central talking points during the campaign. This time, we hardly heard any of that. We hardly heard any discussion on Middle East policy, on the Islamic State, Al-Qaeda, terrorism, or any of those things. This is quite significant and quite astonishing that there is so little of it. Does that mean that the United States is turning inward? Does it mean that because of Trump's isolationist policies, we are seeing this shift? I'm not quite sure that we can talk about the permanent shift. but I think it is extremely symptomatic. I don't recall elections in which foreign policy was less important and less talked about than this one. The other issue that is talked about very little is education. Education had always been one of the issues that was central to the candidates. Of course, if you read their political programs and their campaign platforms, you will find that they talk about these issues. But on the campaign trail and during the debates, they talked very little to nothing about it. And yet this is happening at a time when we have COVID pandemic, when educational system is under stress, when teachers are under stress, when higher education is going through some profound changes and challenges because of COVID, and yet we've heard almost nothing about this. And that's quite symptomatic and quite interesting. So that was my second point. And of course, I could expand on this, but for the sake of time, I'll keep it at this. Number three, this is quite obvious by now that under Trump, the Republican Party has fallen into white nationalism. This has become, in many ways, one of the main defining features of the Republican Party. And again, it remains to be seen if this is going to be a permanent shift or not, but it is very, very significant that we are seeing that. And the question is, for the Republican Party, in case Trump loses, will they be able to shift to a more moderate stance? Or if President Trump wins, I think it will be a win for white nationalism, and that could have severe repercussions for the United States. So that was my point number three, which leads me to point number four, that while this is happening, we are also seeing a tremendous shift in American population, and that is that as Republican Party and Trump are taking on a more pro-white nationalist posture and platform, we're seeing that more and more Americans are becoming supportive of minorities, of immigration, of Black Lives Matter. And then we have an ironic situation that when Trump was elected president, he instituted, or was at least attempting to institute, what came to be known as the Muslim ban. And yet at the same time, it seems like there was no time when Muslims were more mainstream and more accepted in American society than today. I think that partly happened as a reaction to Trump, that those people who are opposed to Trump have embraced Muslims and have tried to engage Muslims in different spheres of life, including in politics. And so you see Muslims being more mainstream today under Trump than ever before. And then another important and related point, number five, is that while Trump's administration had had negative effect on many different things that I think most people are familiar with, one thing that they did promote was religious freedom. And it is interesting that the United States government, including Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, who had in the past issued and spoken negatively about Muslims in general, had actually issued statements that are supportive of Muslims in China and that are calling out the Chinese government for the genocidal policies and the concentration camps that they're building and all of that. President Trump had been supportive of this religious freedom policy, though of course some people are claiming that this religious freedom agenda is pushed by conservative Christians for their own purposes and objectives, and that Muslims and other Muslim minorities and other minorities, religious minorities, are just accidental beneficiaries of these policies. And that, of course, is a longer conversation that probably we don't have time here. But it's an interesting thing that you wouldn't expect that the administration that is trying to enact the Muslim ban is at the same time very supportive of Muslims in China. More supportive, I may say, than probably most, if not all, Muslim countries of the world, at least at the rhetorical level. That is, I think, very, very important. So with that being said, there's much more that could be said, but I wanted to open with this kind of brief salvo, if you will, and then leave it to you and to our guests to ask questions so that I don't monopolize. But I wanted this to be just a starter for our conversation. So you can go ahead and ask questions or follow-ups or comments, or if anybody from the audience, anybody's question. So, Brother Bilal, do you have any?
Okay, Assalamu alaikum, everyone. I'm very happy that we had you, Ermin, with us today. So me personally, I would like, before we get the answer questions from our audience and the people who are watching us, I would like to ask you, you mentioned that, that there wasn't a big focus, let's say, on the international relations and the questions regarding the foreign policy of United States, yeah? So, but still, I would like that we start maybe with the question: what can we expect if the person A or B wins the elections regarding the Muslim world, especially the Middle East? Let's say the Iran nuclear deal, the things around Saudi Arabia, of course, Palestine. But also and because I know that you are an expert and that you know very well the situation in Indonesia and Malaysia, we heard yesterday, or I don't know, or today, maybe even Mike Pompeo, who said that he will, that future US administration will help the religious reformation in Indonesia. So that can also mean something. So what are your thoughts about these developments, or in the future, or in which way it can go if Biden or Trump wins?
Yeah, so interestingly enough, and maybe I'm in the minority here, I think the Trump isolationist policy had been in some way a welcome change. I know that for the past, I don't know how many decades, many Muslims around the world have decried the United States because of its interventionist policies in many parts of the Muslim world. Actually, Trump had in many ways reversed that policy. This doesn't mean that the United States is not involved in operations, in covert operations, in military operations. It just means that I think the intensity is much, much lower. I would say personally, my personal opinion is that that's a welcome thing, actually. Now, of course, we would like the US policy to be proactive in areas in which principles are at stake: protecting human rights, protecting democracy, promoting democracy. Trump has not shown to be much different in that regard than other previous American presidents, but if anything, he had been less interventionist. And for that reason, I think it was a welcome thing. Now, of course, there is the issue of moving the embassy to Jerusalem, and that is a big thing and a big issue. However, what needs to be kept in mind is that the US Congress had actually voted on moving embassy to Jerusalem so many times before. No US president before this decided to actually act on it. Trump was the first president that actually acted on it. So this is not something out of the blue, unprecedented. This is something for which there is a strong support in US Congress. Now, we can disagree with it, we can be unhappy about it, but this is something that US Congress had passed again and again. Trump only decided to actually act on it and to move the embassy to Jerusalem. I don't think that when it comes to the issue of Palestine, there is fundamental difference between the two. Biden had stated many times that he is going to be an unequivocal friend and supporter of the state of Israel, just like Trump is, maybe in a little different way, but I don't see how that is going to change regardless of who is elected. We may see some change in some other parts of the world. I would expect if Biden is elected to become, again, America to become more interventionist as it had been in the past. And this had not always been for the better. This had always not been for, I think, for the good of the countries involved. when it comes to, I haven't seen that statement about Indonesia, but obviously there's been a lot of work that was supported and done in Indonesia by international organizations and agencies promoting religious freedom and whatnot. And I would have to see the content of that statement and to learn more in order to know. What I do know when we're talking about foreign policy, and there was a very good article, I think, in The Atlantic just a few days ago, is that under President Trump, State Department had become politicized in the way that had rarely been the case before. State Department was, in general, an oasis in American administration that provided very professional services, and people who maybe personally may have partisan attachments, but have in the execution of their duties often been seen as impartial and committed to the interest of the United States. Under Tillerson and now under Pompeo, State Department had undergone tremendous change. A lot of people had either retired or had been fired. And the administration had been putting in place the loyalists. And that may reshape. If Trump gets reelected, remember, State Department is basically foreign ministry of the United States, right? We call it the State Department, and it's kind of unfortunate because usually when you think state, we usually think the interior in most of the countries. The United States State Department is de facto foreign ministry. And so if Trump gets reelected, we're going to see even greater reshuffling within the State Department, becoming even more loyalist, more partisan. If Biden gets elected, I'd assume that he's going to reverse some of the policies. And there are so many senior positions right now that are vacant at State Department. There are many important ambassadorial positions that are vacant. And I would assume that by doing those, if Biden is elected, by filling those positions, he could actually influence US foreign policy dramatically. Remains to be seen in which way. But I would assume that we could probably expect a mixture of Clinton-Obama style foreign policy, which does involve neoliberal economy and does involve, in many ways, interventionist policy. At least it is formally, rhetorically committed to promotion of democracy and human rights. In reality, as we know, that hasn't always been the case. Most important and the saddest example is that of Egypt after the coup led by Sisi, which was supported eventually by Obama and the US administration, unfortunately. So we have a bunch of things here.
Yes, thank you for this elaborate answer to Ayub's question. I have to go back to the United States itself and the situation of the Muslims in the United States. We've had certain developments, positive developments. Muslims were elected to the House of Representatives, and I even think to the House, to that, but maybe you could. So there has been a slight shift of the perception of Muslim activism in the United States. But in general terms, I mean, maybe you could respond to this question of mine. What is Muslim activism, political activism, all about in the United States? Muslims in the United States, as other groups are, religious or non-religious, are they a force of within the lobbyist campaigns that are being conducted in the United States? President or elections are on. Do they have some kind of leverage? Can they really play a role in United States politics, and can they kind of create a shift, a positive shift towards Muslim life, the boundaries of the United States and worldwide? I mean, do they have an impact on developments in the United States as far as presidential and other elections are concerned? What is your perception? How do you perceive Muslim life as far as there are even Muslims Trump? There's a group calling itself Muslims for Trump. I read about it a couple of days ago. So this makes me rather sad. I mean, how can a Muslim support a person like Trump? And I'm also flabbergasted by the fact that evangelicals and very devout Christians are sub-Trump. There seems to be a lot of questions with regard to the that religious groups are conducting in the United States. You could shed some of this issue.
All right. So to the extent that I understood, and I don't know if it's everybody or just me, but you were breaking up a lot when you were talking, Brother Bilal. But to the extent that I understood what you were asking, important thing to remember is that the United States is a very large country, 350 million people, right? Muslims are constituting maybe 1 to 1.5% of that population. Most generous people say 6 to 7 million, which would be 2%. So we're talking here about a very, very small minority. That's actually much more visible. I would say that the United States Muslims, American Muslims, are punching well above their weight. We are punching well above our weight simply because at 2% or 1 to 1.5% of the population, you wouldn't expect us to be in the eyes of the public that much, and yet we are. I mean, American Muslims are everywhere, from the entertainment to artists to politicians like Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib and many others who are active in politics. Former Keith Ellison, former congressman, now Attorney General of the state of Minnesota. Muslims are in very prominent positions. You have Muslims in Biden campaign. Just last week, relevant to Muslims in Europe and the Balkans, we've seen a 2-page document issued by Biden administration, his statement on Bosnia. Now that's not necessarily a Muslim thing. It's not viewed through a Muslim lens, yet you have a Bosnian who is a member of Biden campaign who had influenced Biden campaign into committing to have a more proactive policy on Bosnia and to reforming some of the problems that were created by the Dayton Peace Accords 1995. So you have all of these things. There's been an attempt by Muslims in the United States to create some kind of umbrella organization. There is an organization right now that includes almost all major Muslim organizations. Recently, there's been quite a bit of controversy because one of them had been called out or had decided to step out because of its link to policies that were seen as friendly toward the state of Israel, and they've been criticized by a lot of other Muslim groups for that. So there is a debate within the Muslim community on those issues. Can Muslims act as a political bloc? I think that is very unlikely. And even if they did, they would still be a very small minority. However, I think what Muslims can do, they can act strategically on a few select issues that they think are important. Now, the problem is, of course, that even within the Muslim community, there is quite a divergence of views on a number of issues. There are very few issues on which Muslims are largely united, and you will even pointed out the fact that there are Muslims who are voting for Trump, even though they are in the minority, that there are still some. And if you're wondering why, I'll give you an anecdotal. This is not research-based. I'll give you an anecdotal evidence. So about a month and a half ago, I was going to Chicago, and I stopped at some Bosnian Muslim friends in Michigan, and we started talking about politics. And the couple basically said that they are considering voting for Trump. And I asked them, why are you thinking that way? And they said, well, we don't like this LGBT thing being shoved down our children's throat in schools, you know? And they see that if Biden is elected, that's going to only increase. And so for some Muslim families, at least, they feel that they are being basically forced into this LGBT thing. Even if they personally disagree with it, if they don't accept it, if they think that religiously they are not comfortable with it, they are not given a choice. That the administration, especially under Obama, was pushing down educational policies and other policies that would teach children about these things, which some Muslim families obviously find unacceptable. And the question is, to what extent do you weigh these issues? To what extent this issue outweighs many other issues that Trump is bad on? But at least in the minds of some, I think, Muslims, Muslim families, that anecdotally I've only heard, but I've heard more than one. I've heard several people who've told me the same thing. Other people are simply pragmatic. They said, look, Trump is good for my business. I'm a business person. He reduced taxes on businesses. I'm making more money. And basically that's for him, for that person, the bottom line is that. That maybe is selfish, but you know, we all make choices based on a variety of issues. So so that's kind of in a nutshell. I think that's pretty much what I wanted to say here. The big difference between Europe and the United States, in Europe you have 20, 30 different countries, right? And Muslims, you know, all across these countries, influencing their own governments. Here you have a huge country and one government. So in some way it is easier because you know where the levers of power are. On the other hand, because it's such a huge country, it's very hard to create some sort of united action or collective action on these issues.
Yeah, but I would pose the question here regarding, because you mentioned now Europe, and we had also already some comment regarding what is going on Facebook, what is going on in France. So maybe you can give us a little, you know, maybe, you know, your thoughts about these differences, because you mentioned already about these differences between Europe and American, and especially American secular, the relationship of the state toward the religion, and the secularism in Europe and secularism in United States. And I would also say that you wrote a couple of very, very good articles at Al Jazeera Balkans. And you, in one of them, you mentioned the Ahmed Kuru, what he was referring to the passive and assertive secularism. So can you elaborate a little bit of these differences between the United States and Europe, and what that means on the practical level? Yeah.
Sure. So political scientist Ahmed Kuru, who teaches at San Diego State University, published a book some 10 years ago or so, maybe even 12 years ago. I think it's based on his dissertation, in which he studied secularism in different countries, different societies. And he came up with these ideas, with this description, which I think is very useful in understanding different types of secularism. He talks about assertive and passive secularism. Assertive secularism is a type of secularism that we see now in France, for instance, that we used to see in Turkey until fairly recently, in which the state takes very active role to assert its own dominion, to assert its own sovereignty over religious communities, to determine how religious communities can operate, what they can do, what they cannot do, what kind of religion is acceptable and what kind of religion is not acceptable, officially endorsed. And we are hearing all of this in recent comments by French President Macron, right? The other type of secularism is passive secularism that is more prevalent in the, for lack of a better term, the Anglo-Saxon world, you know, in the UK, the United States, and so on. That kind of secularism also separates between religion and politics, but it gives religion much more leeway, much more freedom. We know that in the United States, in the US Constitution, in the First Amendment, there is that famous clause which says that Congress shall make no law regarding the establishment of religion or free expression or free exercise thereof. You know, the writer of the Declaration of Independence and the third US President, Thomas Jefferson, he wrote that this First Amendment had basically established a wall of separation between religion and politics, which I did call a permeable wall of separation, because it's not a wall that completely separates it. There's always kind of influence between the two, but it's more organic. There is much more leeway in, for instance, US society. There is much more freedom. Nobody is going to interfere. The state may say which kind of Islam they would, you know, politicians can say, we would like to see moderate Islam and this and that. And yet they simply have no right to intervene with Muslim communities to tell them what kind of Islam they should practice, which in a more assertive secular societies such as France, Turkey until recently, and many other continental European countries, we find much more of that. So based on these two different notions and two different histories of secularism in these type of governments and societies, we see how in the United States, I would say that the scope and for Islamic activism, for Muslim practice is much wider than in most countries of Europe, for instance. And in Europe, it's been getting worse. I think in the United States, of course, you hear about Islamophobic incidents. You find attacks against Muslims, especially Muslim women who wear hijab because they are visibly identifiable as Muslims. But yet, by and large, you will find that there is much greater acceptance. Talk about, for instance, the issue of women in hijab finding work. I know that in the United States, it's not without its problems. But on average, overall, I think it is much better than what you find in most countries in Europe, whether it be teachers in schools, professors at universities, and so on. In some countries in Europe, you have basically laws that ban Muslim women from wearing hijab if they are working in public offices and so on. There is no such law in the United States, where there was a discriminatory policy. It was almost always successfully challenged in US courts. And the US courts have affirmed free practice of religion for the most part in these cases. So there's a lot of different issues, obviously, that one can talk about, but those are some of the basic things. And I think this understanding of difference between assertive and passive secularism helps us in understand nature of society and government in different countries and how it is either conducive to or oppressive of religious practice.
Yeah, but I would like, okay, I agree with this, what you said definitely about the secularism, but then I have another question regarding the United States. Maybe I agree with you that the system is definitely different, but what is your stake, or what are your thoughts? Because we hear a lot from the Muslim organizations and some intellectuals about very invasive CVE, counterviolent extremist programs in the United States. So recently we had numerous of also Zoom conferences and talks and everything regarding, which was organized, by the way, from, for example, by Coalition for Civil Freedoms. Also, there was a famous RAND publication from 2003, how to develop this moderate Islam, how to interfere, how to, and so on, to influence the Muslim community in the United States. So what do you think about this and about these issues and discussions that we heard lately regarding the United States?
Yeah, I mean, obviously there is an attempt. See, RAND is a think tank. It's not a governmental institution, right? So it's a think tank. They published that influential study. Yes, it was taken up by some people in the government and also in civil society to try to influence development of Islam in a certain way. What I'm trying to say is that in no way does it prevent Muslims to act in the United States in a different manner. Even if the government adopts certain policies like the CVE, countering violent extremism, that does not necessarily mean imposition on Muslim communities in the United States. Yes, it is influential. Yes, it penetrates many aspects of Muslim life in the United States. Yes, it has been controversial. Yes, it has been discussed and debated. At the same time, even if it's an official US government policy, it does have a different ring than, let's say, when a French government adopts a certain policy. When the French government adopts a certain policy, for instance, you have every single institution of the government committed to that particular thing. In the United States, even the government itself, it's very diffused. It's decentralized, state governments from the federal government, different institutions within federal government. And then you have a very vibrant civil society that is often pushing against these. Human rights groups, civil rights groups, ACLU, Amnesty International, many others who had supported Muslim communities in this. That's much harder to do in a country like France, where the government may even restrict these civil society institutions in operating in a certain way. That doesn't really necessarily happen that way in the United States. So yes, there is always, look, there are always multiple interests. The founders of the United States have written that. If you read the Federalist Papers, you'll find that they have widely written about different interest groups, interest in society, and you have those within the government, outside the government. But there is no one single unified way of thinking about these issues. It's a very pluralistic society, and that leaves a lot of space for Muslim institutions to be able to come into this space. May I just address something? I see that Professor Kaminsky has been writing a bit about these things here in the group chat.
He posted two already, just to that you know. I now noticed not only one, he posted already. Professor Kaminsky, Assalamu alaikum to you, and Jazakallah for your comments. They are more than interesting. So Ermin, if you can reflect upon them. I think it is maybe too much that I read them, so you can, or should I read them? What do you?
No, I think they're very long, and I can't address every single thing that he writes about here. What I want to highlight is when we're talking about Muslim activism, especially Muslim political activism in the United States, there is today in the United States, as it had been the case for the past several decades, a different type of political activism that is enacted by African American Muslims as opposed to the immigrant Muslims. Now, let me now backtrack a little bit. In the essay that I wrote for Al Jazeera Balkans, you've noticed that I started with the story of Kunta Kinte from Roots, right? And Kunta Kinte, who is, you know, this emblematic figure that many people have heard of, a lot of people had watched Roots, and some people even use the name Kunta Kinte to describe any person of African origin, which is, I think, detestable. I don't think anybody should be doing that. But it just tells how much that personality and that name had impacted a lot of people thinking about the African people. Kunta Kinte was a Muslim. He was a Muslim in the book. He was a Muslim in that TV series. In Annapolis, Maryland, where I used to work at the United States Naval Academy, there is a Alex Haley Kunta Kinte Memorial. So it's a memorial that's dedicated to a Muslim who was brought into the United States and sold into slavery. Very few people know that he was a Muslim. Very few people know that such a formative figure in memory of slavery and the United States predates American Republic. This is way before the United States was created as a country, that Muslims were present in this country. When in the 20th century, there was a sort of a return among some African Americans to Islam, with the awakening of their own identity and consciousness, many of them felt that Islam was part of their culture with which they were brought into the United States. And, you know, estimates vary, but anywhere between 10 to 25% of all the slaves that were brought into the United States were originally Muslim. So so there was a conversion of African Americans to Islam. And because they were habituated into the United States, they were around for centuries, they knew this country inside out, and they especially knew the underbelly, the dark side of the American society. They developed a certain type of political activism that is different from the type of political activism that we are seeing among mainly immigrant Muslim communities that had dominated the Muslim scene since the 1960s onwards. So in the 1960s, I think President Johnson passes this law that allows increased immigration. A lot of people from Muslim countries, Muslim majority countries, migrate into the United States, and the immigrants become majority of Muslims eventually in the United States. Prior to that, majority of Muslims in the United States were African Americans. And because they were domestic population, so to say, they had a different way of politics and also informed by their own experience. Very few people know that there used to exist Islamic Party of North America that was led by African-American Muslims in the 60s and the 70s. I'm not sure exactly, might have been 70s, but it was during that period. And it was based on the ideas, a hodgepodge of ideas of different Muslim thinkers, whether they be from the Ikhwan, but also many others. And they created their own native Islamic Party movement that didn't last too long, but it is part of American history. I would dare say that no immigrant Muslim would dare create an Islamic Party in the United States today for the reasons that are too obvious. But African-American Muslims have different sensibilities, and they understand politics differently. And to tell you honestly, from my interactions, they are much braver, much more courageous, and much more direct than a lot of immigrants who tend to oftentimes be, our situation is in some ways better and in some ways more precarious as immigrants. And for that reason, a lot of immigrants stay away from that kind of rhetoric that is often seen as confrontational and so on, but could be also understood as simply a expression of their own identity and their own willingness to engage American political system. So it is very different. You could say that toward the end of the 1990s, there was maybe a moment where there was some type, like what Professor Kaminsky says here, Islamic political culture. I would say that probably in the late 1990s up to 9/11, that the, let's say, Ikhwan style activism was quite prominent among American Muslims in general. But then 9/11 happened, and all of that became basically impossible, uncalled for, or disallowed, if you will. And so, for that reason, I think that what we are seeing today is that the old style African-American politics had died out, the Nation of Islam, Malcolm X, and even more of a Salafi politics that was especially strong in the 70s and the 80s in the African-American Muslim communities. And then the Ikhwan style activism had also, to a large extent, been clipped. So what we're having now is emergence of a more American style politics among the Muslims, for better or worse, it's more mainstream. That also means that there is a much smaller possibility for change, because it operates within a very narrow framework, as opposed to what we traditionally had been thinking of as Muslim political activism, whether of the African-American type or a kind of more Ikhwan or Salafi type. Now you're having more kind of mainstream. Most of the young Muslims are gravitating toward either Democratic political party, the Democrats, or progressive politics. Recent polls have shown in surveys that majority of young Americans are in support of LGBT rights and same-sex marriage. And that shows, on the one hand, accommodation of Muslims within. It also shows lack of imagination among American Muslims, because it seems to me that a lot of American Muslims can only imagine politics and think about politics within the framework that had been set up by the two dominant parties in the United States, and not outside that framework. And that in a way indicates poverty of political imagination among American Muslims.
Can I pose just a tackle, because this is regarding what you said now, and you mentioned about this next young generation of American Muslims, yeah? So I know that, I think that maybe even with you, I discussed in the past about this very interesting article that was published by Ismail Royer and on Muslim Matters. And he was very critical about this, what is going on with the younger generation of American Muslims and this tendencies to go into this, let's say, progressive, this racial theories and so on and so on. So what are your thoughts about this and his criticism, what he exposed in his article? I think that it is interesting to maybe reflect on it. Especially because you also, in the very beginning of this whole conversation, you answered why that you met some of your friends on airport who said that they don't want to vote for the Democrats because of these kind of policies, and because of this that they are voting for Trump. So this is maybe in line, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, yeah, I'm sure there are many Muslims, especially of the older generation, who do not.
I think that Brother Bilal wants to just add.
You want to say something? Go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to the question that Ayub just posed. It was very interesting to get the information that there is an Americanization of Muslim thought or Muslim activism in the United States. And I think that is something that really that deserves some more consideration. What this Americanization of Muslim activism is all about. And I would like to add to the question that Ayub just brought up, a question that has reached us from Malta, from a brother in Malta. He is asking, what is the opinion of the Muslim community in the United States with regard to Trump's fake peace process between some Arab countries and Israel? I think these questions are interconnected. Because I would like to elaborate, does the Muslim community in the United States feel somehow connected to the Muslim Ummah in general? Is there an interconnection, or is it becoming more and more Americanized, that American issues are at the forefront, are more important to them than Muslim issues in general? I think these questions should be answered collectively. If you could elaborate. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. So yeah, I think that Muslims in America are going through the same Americanization path that all the previous communities, that religious and other minorities have gone through when they came to the United States. You know, trying in the beginning to establish their own institutions, to retain their own identity and whatnot. But America is a very strong, very powerful, very large country with a very strong economic system, and it grinds people down. And a lot of people, I think, accept the rules of the game, and they just want to sit at the table. And the best way to have a seat at the table is to accept the rules of the game and to not try to attempt to sort of change anything much, you know. Again, work within those very narrow parameters that are established by the political system. One of my favorite stories that I ever heard was when the American Jews, as American Jewish immigration into the United States, early 20th century increased, and they created, I believe it was a Jewish theological seminary, but it may be one of the other Jewish seminaries, religious institutions. And when the first generation of students were graduating from that Jewish theological school, during the dinner in celebration, graduation, the menu that was delivered to them, that was given to them, had one of the first items on menu was shrimps, prawns. And of course, anybody who knows Jewish law knows that prawns or shrimp are treif. They are not kosher. They are not halal, you know, for the Jews to consume. So you have a first generation of American Jewish clergy who are dining on shrimp and are basically in some ways saying that we are adapting to the American environment, the equivalent of this, I don't know what would the equivalent of this be. If you're a very strict Hanafi and eating shrimp, maybe, but it's not as big as that. That's really trife. That's how, the only thing I can think of is that you would have graduates of a Muslim seminary in the US and serving wine or pork at the graduation dinner. I mean, that's a big deal, right? But
we had it in Germany. A federal conference on Islam was conducted last year, and they served pork to all the Muslims participating.
Yeah, so and in some ways, but this was done by the Jews themselves. But in some ways, when this happens, like the incident that you just mentioned, is seen as a test of loyalty, right? I still remember to this day when I was in the Yugoslav army, and the Serb soldier basically trying to convince me to eat pork. And it's not just about eating pork, it's that he would derive such tremendous pleasure at seeing me eating pork. That's the thing, if we could all now sit somewhere in Germany and they serve us pork and we all eat pork, it would not only be us capitulating with our beliefs and practices, it would also mean that we would provide tremendous satisfaction to those watching us eat that, And I could never quite fully explain where psychologically that comes from. Why would they have such tremendous need for seeing Muslims doing something that Muslims would consider prohibited? Because I personally do not have any kind of will or wish to see somebody of a different religion doing something that religion prohibits to them. But when it comes to Muslim, this is an interesting thing. And yeah, so this is very interesting. So that's Americanization that we're talking about. That is the kind of thing that some people are pushing for. Now, American Muslims, I think, for the large part, have remained committed to a lot of Islamic practices. Again, America is a different society. It's a much freer society. People actually respect when you say, this is what I do and this is what I don't do for the most part. If you request certain types of meal at public occasions, they most of the time they not only go out, they only accommodate you, they go out of their way to accommodate you. So again, when it comes to the United States, it may be a little different. And so I don't know if I addressed everything you asked because it was such a broad conversation.
Yes, the Middle East. The Middle East was raised. Yeah.
I mean, there is obviously what the questioner asked is a fake peace process. It's not, depends where you are, For the Israelis, if they could really convince the Emiratis and the Saudis and the Bahrainis and the Kuwaitis and others to accept them, for them, this is a good thing from peace perspective, meaning they're not going to be attacked from the outside. But it's not a peace that is comprehensive. It is not peace that is inclusive. It is not peace that is just. And that is a problem, obviously. The Palestinians would never consider that to be a real good peace. They would not consider that. That would be peace between Israel and some Arab states. It would not necessarily be peace between Israelis and the Palestinians. And it would definitely not be just. It would not be welcome. I mean, Trump is doing what he believes is the right thing, which is, for him to secure the state of Israel. And he has found in MBZ and MBS and all of these corrupt leaders in Muslim countries, he had found supporters to enact that. And this was the time to do it because, you never know when these people are going to go. Obviously, the bigger question is if they do go and another government is established in these countries, are they going to honor that agreement or not? But that's a different question, and we can only hypothesize about it. So yeah, I mean, I think from the U.S. perspective, from the Israeli perspective, this would be seen as a really good deal. Actually,
oh yeah, definitely.
If I were a Trump supporter, I would say he's done on this issue more than probably anybody since President Carter, who brokered Camp David Accords. So in a way, it's the United States had always been very pro-Israeli, And from that point of view, if you just eliminate every sentiment and emotion that you may have, Trump had been very, very successful in that regard. He's done more to enact US foreign policy as it had been stated over the decades than probably any president in recent memory.
Yeah.
That's a very pragmatic way of looking at it, obviously. I'm not agreeing with that. I'm just saying this is how, you know,
Yeah.
he's being pragmatically more successful. I mean, nobody's talking about Al-Qaeda and Islamic State any longer. It's not that they don't exist, they do, but, you know, because of COVID and other things and what have you, he's pulled out the troops from different countries. He's actually done some of the things that Muslims had been asking from the beginning, like pull out of Syria, pull out of Iraq, pull out of Afghanistan. He's actually done more in that regard than Obama, you know?
Yeah, you're right. Yeah.
As you know, as hard it is for people to hear this or accept it. In that regard, you could say he's even better than Obama, you know? He's being non-interventionist. I would say there is maybe more chance for some kind of a solution settlement in Afghanistan, and you probably know this much, much better than I do, than before. And partly it's because Trump had sought to disengage from that conflict, you know? So I think we need to be also fair and balanced when we're trying to talk about this. And I know that we said we're going to be going for 1 hour, and it's been 1 hour already. I know there's like 1 million other questions that we could ask and talk about, but I'll leave it to you.
There are actually two more questions which I could combine. Maybe that would be a final question. I don't know, Ayub, how you, I mean, do you have something which you would like?
I would also like, because we in the past, last two conversations that we had, we a little bit neglected the comments that came from our viewers. So this time we have already 4 questions that are posed by our viewers. So let us go with Bilal, with your question, of course, Brother Bilal, and then afterwards we can finish with these 3 questions from our viewers, okay?
Yeah, I'd like to pick up 2 questions from our viewers. I would like to combine them. One question we were raised by Brother Nizar is, to what extent could a potential Joe Biden democratic government societal divide in the United States impact populist wave in Europe? And to this question, there is a question from Aya. I hope it's email, I don't know, whatever. What's the possible impact of US election news rhetoric used to independent media? I think both are interlinked. I mean, creating societal divide, lies and news interconnected, interrelated issue. If you could kind of elaborate this as well.
All right. So, yeah, I mean, there's no doubt that President Trump has emboldened the autocrats all around the world, whether it be Putin. I would even put Erdogan in that. I know many of you would disagree with me, but I would put him in that same basket, if you will. Orban in Hungary, many others have felt, I think, comforted by Trump and his rhetoric. I think that if Joe Biden is elected, he would change that. He would change that rhetoric, and I think he would call, at least rhetorically, he would hold these autocrats accountable, and I think he would, at least rhetorically, stand for the values of democracy and human rights that the United States had for decades publicly stated that it's supportive of. Would that necessarily change the populist wave in Europe? I'm not sure, because I think a lot of populist wave in Europe is autochthonous, if you will. It is based within the European politics. I do not think necessarily that Biden becoming president is going to stop that, but at least it's going to remove some level of legitimacy to that politics. So that definitely would happen. Would it heal the societal divide in the US? No, I don't think so. I think the United States has become a very polarized society, and I think that's going to continue for a long time. That's going to continue. The question is, to what extent would different poles grow? Would one grow larger than the other? Would one of them shrink over time? That remains to be seen. But I think the polarization that we're seeing is going to continue for quite some time. Finally, the possible impact of US election, the fake news rhetoric. I mean, yeah, Biden probably is not going to tweet at 6 a.m. or 5 o'clock in the morning with some kind of fake news and repeating those kind of things. But I don't think fake news is going to stop. As long as we have social media that we do, and as long as governments of China and Russia and many other oppressive governments of the world have access to those, they're going to pursue that kind of rhetoric and those fake news. Maybe the United States would under Biden get a little better at countering that, a little better at controlling it, maybe institute some new policies for Facebook and Twitter and others to control these type of fake news, but I don't think that's going to stop. If anything, I think we're going to see more of it. We're going to see more of it, which makes it even more imperative for us to be well informed and to be really balanced in our worldview, to be able to interpret that.
And we had the final question, and this can be what you said about the human rights and Biden, yeah. So we had a very interesting question regarding his record by Boyan Budimec. The question is about whitewashing of or disregarding the record of Joe Biden until now. And also he's referring to the record that shows that essentially he's a warmonger from whom there was no bad war. Sponsorship also of 1994 crime law that targeted blacks and Hispanics. And so on. So isn't it a kind of liberal progressive myopia to ignore the very existence of the dark side of Joe Biden? So this is the question regarding the Biden.
No, I think it is. I think it is. I mean, Joe Biden has been in the government, for 47 years now. He's been in the Senate, he's been the vice president, and every war, every intervention that the United States was part of during that time, he in some way had been part of, whether supporting or against, for the most part, he was supportive of most of interventionist policies. In that regard, he's no different than Obama. In that regard, he's no different than Clinton. I think, yeah, liberal progressives do have this myopia when it comes to the record of their own candidates, so to say. Obama had probably bombed more Muslim countries and had used drone assassinations more than probably anybody else. So yeah, I mean, it is there. At the same time, a third candidate, someone like Bernie Sanders, had not been able to come to the forefront to become a candidate of the Democratic Party in the last two elections. And that tells us a lot about the US system.
Okay, so I think we have been able to at least shed some light on so many questions that have been raised. Many questions are still there that need some further reflection. I think one of the points that I'm going to take home was a very interesting statement that Brother Ermin made on the issue of integration versus assimilation in the United States, the concept of the salad bowl, where are the Muslims within this salad bowl, so-called salad bowl, which is the United States. But I think that is a very, very important topic, a very huge topic that needs separate sessions that we have to address, and maybe we'll take it up later on Ayub in our post live discussion to find to find a spot in our series of lectures where this issue of assimilation versus integration as concepts can be addressed. Thank you very much, Dr. Ermin Sinanović, for the time that you have given us. We are over time, almost 10, 15 minutes, but that's okay. That's within the academic limits, at least here in Germany. So I think we can wrap it up here. I would like to give the floor to Brother Ayub for the final statement and some more information on the next conference, which is only a few days away. Ayub, you have the floor.
Yeah, Jazakallah, Brother Bilal. So I would like just in the end to announce that we will have, inshallah, Rabbil Alameen, in the next week, during the next week, probably on Wednesday or Thursday, the special edition of EMN Conversation Series, which will be dedicated to the situation in France, which is quite alarming. And we also had some questions and comments in our comment section on YouTube and Facebook regarding this issue and regarding the France and why we are not addressing this issue. So all of you who watched this conversation series with our distinguished guest Ermin Sinanović, all of you can watch us and be during the next week, in the next 3 or 4 days, next 3 or 4 days, we will have special edition on France and what is going on in France. And also I would like to announce already now, because we already agreed upon this, this is EMN Conversation Series that will take part on 8th of November with Professor Jasser Auda. But of course, follow us on the Facebook page of EMN, and you will be, of course, we will give all the announcements on time. So Jazakallah to everyone who watched us. The Jazakallah to my dear friend and brother Dr. Ermin, and hope to see you soon, inshallah.
Thank you so much. Assalamu alaikum.
Inshallah, thank you very much. We may meet again and ask for your expertise and assessment on the result of the presidential elections. Once it is available, it may take weeks until it is available because there have been so many voters who have voted already via letters. So, well, let's see how things are going to develop. Let's pray that it will be in the best of interest of the Muslim Ummah in the United States and the Muslim Ummah at large. And let's hope that we all are guided by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala towards his path and only his path. Thank you very much, Brother Ermin Sinanović. It was a pleasure having you here with us at EMN Conversation Series. We hope to see you again. Stay connected with us. You are really great in your assessments. And I think many of our viewers will take away from this conversation a more balanced approach towards the United States and what is actually going on in the United States right at the moment. At least I'll do. Thank you. Thank you, Brother Ayub. Thank you, Brother Ermin. Thank you, Nizar, for the technical backup. And thank you, Sahih Adirovic and Sarajevo for participating. And thank you all for giving your time. Hope to see you again, inshallah, on Wednesday or Thursday or coming Sunday. All the best to you. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.